on Books vs. Films, we're going to be taking a look at a book-to-movie adaptation that teaches us that we should be nice to all living creatures, no matter how big or small they are. And if you thought I was talking about Horton Hears a Who, then you're sorely mistaken. Anyway, guys, this is my Books vs. Films review of The Ant Bully. The Ant Bully is one of those movies that I've heard a lot about in passing, but never got the chance to sit down and watch it. Mainly because around that time period, I wasn't interested in seeing it. Now sure, I grew up with the book and knew about the movie's existence, but keep in mind that this came out around the same time I was just starting middle school, and during that time period, I used to categorize cartoons and family movies as being nothing more than kid stuff. But then I grew up and realized that, hey, a lot of family movies and cartoons can be more thought-provoking than I give them credit for.
We're number 2!
Well, for the most part. However, it wasn't very long until the movie gained a cult following, thanks to the internet, when I rediscovered the movie and decided to watch it for the very first time. And after watching the movie and doing my research, the production history for this movie is a lot more interesting than the movie itself. Just like how Danny DeVito was inspired to make a Matilda movie right after reading the book to his children, Tom Hanks had the same inspiration when reading The Ant Bully to his son right before bedtime. It turns out that he liked the book so much that he partnered up with John A. Davis along with his animation company, DNA Productions. Never heard of DNA Productions? Well, if you haven't, you might remember them as the studio that brought you Jimmy Neutron, as well as this monstrosity.
Hi, I'm Paul.
I swear that monkey always gives me the creeps. While the movie was successful worldwide, it sadly underperformed at the box office domestically, which caused the studio to go through massive layoffs, bankruptcy, and inevitably, the cancellation of Jimmy Neutron's 4th season. But with all the production issues aside, how well does the movie adapt the book of the same name? Well, in terms of how an adaptation should go, I think they did a pretty decent job with this one. Granted, there were a few liberties taken when it came to adapting this to the big screen, but other than that, the movie follows the basic premise of the book pretty well. A boy gets bullied by the bigger kids in the neighborhood, which causes him to take out his aggression on the ants. This starts to become a recurring pattern with the ants to the point where they had enough, or had enough according to the book. Yeah, I know that it's grammatically correct in a technical sense, but the phrase had has been falling out of usage for some time to the point where it just comes off as awkward to read. Anyway, the boy gets dragged down to the ant hole where the ants decide to give him a second chance by putting him through a series of tasks. He learns a lesson at the end, he turns back to normal, and all's well that ends well. The movie uses the book as sort of a blueprint, taking noteworthy events from the book and expanding it into a full-fledged story. We get key moments from the book, like the battle with the wasps and the journey to gather the jelly beans, but the pacing of the movie, I will admit, can be a little jumbled at times. I know it's a short book, so there's not that much story to work with, but most of these events seem to be placed in such a random and odd order, especially with the book having a perfect, yet simplistic, beginning, middle, and end. On top of that, the movie throws in this liar-revealed subplot that feels out of place within the story's narrative. Throughout the entire movie, we see that Lucas has this unforgivable sense of guilt dangling over his head ever since the exterminator tricked him into signing up for his pest control services. Not sure what the legal ramifications would be after letting a minor sign a contract to a service he doesn't know what he's getting into, but regardless, Lucas has signed the contract, and that means that he has the responsibility to cancel it. But instead of telling the ants what kind of danger they're in and asks to help him put a stop to it, he tells them a convincing little fib to get to the nearest phone so he can call the whole thing off. And how does he get their attention? With product placement! I mean food. Yeah, it's not like in the book where Lucas was ordered by the queen to go get the jelly beans as a final test. In this version, he uses it to distract the ants while he calls the exterminator to cancel the order, only for him to accidentally dial the wrong number and call a pizzeria instead.
Please cancel the contract! No exterminator!
No extra tomato. Got it. Okay, I will admit that got a chuckle out of me.
It isn't until the exterminator arrived at Lucas's front yard when Lucas started to confess to the colony that he was the one who sent the exterminator to his house. And you'll probably think that this will be the part where the colony loses all trust in Lucas, leading to the third act breakup and everything going downhill from here.
Doc, you shrunk me. You can shrink the cloud breather.
Or we could just brush it under the rug, despite half the story being built up to this one moment, rendering this subplot to be entirely pointless.
That's pretty weak.
And it's a shame too, because the Exterminator is a funny character. But yet the way they introduced this character by writing in a subplot to justify his existence being there didn't really pan out as well as the writers expected it would be. I know that he wasn't a character in the book and he was only created for the movie because they needed a bad guy for some reason, but I feel like there's so many ways that you could introduce him into the story. Here's what I think would have been a better idea. Have Lucas reject his offer at first, but leave his business card and information on the table. That way, when Lucas and the ants start to gather food on the kitchen counter, the sister would spot them and call the exterminator to take care of the so-called infestation. Lucas catches wind of this conversation, rushes over to warn the ants, they have a big epic battle at the end, and everyone lives happily ever after.
There. I just gave you a good idea that could potentially save the script without sacrificing good storytelling. You're welcome.
Now, that's not to say that I didn't enjoy Paul Giamatti's performance as the Exterminator because, like I said before, this is a funny character. Mainly because he's so over-the-top insane that it's impossible not to be invested in this character while he's on screen. He sort of reminds me of Orin Scrivello from Little Shop of Horrors in the sense that he loves to do what he does for a living, but for all the wrong reasons.
And if there's one thing that Paul Giamatti knows how to do best, it's to take a small villain role and make it memorable. Though I find it very weird that he went up against two wall crawlers in both movies.
In addition to having a memorable villain, the other characters are pretty likable as well. Each of them have their own unique personality that stands out from one another, which is unlike the book since the ants barely interact with Lucas outside of one conversation. If anything, Lucas mostly interacts with the Queen in the book, while her character only shows up twice in the movie version. The human characters I can definitely do without, except for the Exterminator because he's hilarious, and the neighborhood bully because may we not forget without him, Lucas wouldn't bully the ants and the ants wouldn't shrink him down to size, thus he wouldn't learn the lesson and there wouldn't be a movie. Speaking of which, the movie lampshades the book's message on bullying and mostly focuses on another lesson entirely, which is not a bad lesson to teach to children, but if the point of the original source material is to teach children that bullying is wrong, wouldn't it make more sense to have that be the main focus of the movie? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the movie should hammer in the message until you're deaf in the ear, but make it prominent enough to where the lesson is being taught and not vaguely skimmed over just to check a box off of a list. The book was able to teach this lesson in the most simplistic yet effective way. When Lucas starts to answer some questions that the ants have about his world, he mentions about the bully and the things that he would do to him.
I was no giant,
Replied Lucas.
not compared with Sid the bully. He was always stealing my hat and spraying me with the hose. Oh, like you did us?
Said Speedy and Renee together. After an awkward silence, the three set out for Lucas's house. The movie does touch upon this subject very slightly, but not enough to where the message left that much of an impact as it did in the book. I mean, they do try to convey the message that was in the book, but it feels incredibly rushed to the point where Zach and Lucas's chemistry just felt underdeveloped. In fact, you can just sum up their chemistry as being nothing more than, I drowned dear Connie because I was angry. Well, I shrunk you down to the size of an ant because I was angry. Yeah, I wasn't thinking before I acted. Neither did I. I guess we're not so different after all. Did we just become best friends? I believe so.
Yeah, you see what I mean? It just feels so shoehorned in.
The chemistry between Lucas and the other characters, however, was handled perfectly well. Though if you really want me to nitpick, I do believe that the relationship between Fugax and Krila was incredibly forced and served no purpose to the story. But other than that, I like these two characters and how they interact with one another. I especially like the relationship between Lucas and Hova.
Hey, don't look at me that way. That's her actual name in the movie. It's not like I'm calling her a hoe or anything.
While I do like the comic relief that Fugax and Krila brought to the table, I feel like Hova carries the heart and soul of this movie. The way she treats Lucas like the child she never had is very believable and heartwarming at the same time. And come on, who can say no to that face?
Now that's a face that can give Puss in Boots a run for his money.
However, if there was one advantage that the movie has over the book, it would have to be the world building. Seriously, I have to give credit where credit is due. The writers really knocked it out of the park with this one. They didn't have to provide this much lore for a kids movie, but by golly, they went the extra mile and did it anyway. Now granted, one can make the argument that we've seen this before in other animated movies like Ants and a Bug's Life, but that seems to be more on the surface level. I feel like the writers brought something unique to the table that we haven't seen in these two movies before. Sure, we get to see the ants provide food for the colony, and we see the main characters go to the outside world and meet other bugs, but other than that, that's where the comparisons end there. Most of the time, it takes the Dancing with Wolves route, where the fish out of water character has to adapt to another culture's way of life, and admittedly, it's pretty creative. They have their own culture, their own terminology for everyday things, their own religion, their own customs. It's like the world of Pandora if it was run by ants. And as far as the book goes, yeah, it's pretty much non-existent. It's almost like our world, but on a much smaller scale. Heck, they even have plumbing to take baths with and electricity to watch TV with. Seriously, tell me how that works. But in the book's defense, small details like that aren't called into question because it's a short 20-page book that is targeted towards little bitty kids. The book is more focused on giving us a good story rather than building the world around it, and the movie is more focused on the world building rather than telling a solid story with a third act structure. And if I had to choose which one I like the best, I would definitely pick a better story over world building any day of the week.
And that's why I believe that the book version is the clear winner of this books versus films debate.
Who invited Captain Party Pooper?
Anyway, that was my books versus films review of The Ant Bully, and yeah, I can understand why Tom Hanks wanted to adapt this book.
The best way to describe this movie is wasted potential. There's a good movie somewhere beneath it all, but there's so many problems that hold it back from being a good movie. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad I saw it and I got some enjoyment out of those good moments, but I don't think it's as good as everyone's hyping it up to be, at least in my personal opinion. It's a decent movie, but calling it a cult classic that needs to be seen, that's kind of a stretch.
But if I had to grade this movie on its own merits, it would probably have to be an A- for the characters, a C+ for the story, a C- for the message, and an A++ on its world building, which brings the movie's grade point average to a B+. Anyway guys, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.